we'll switch it on.
I think we're all here now. So I would like to welcome you all to this Area of Advanced Initiative seminar about AI, economy, and social impact. I would also like to welcome our online participants. We're about 150 people here in the room and roughly as many online. So it's great to see such a big interest. My name is Moa Johansson. I'm an associate professor in the Division of Data Science and AI here at Chalmers. And I'm also the co-director of the area of advance in information and communication technology, who are organizing this event here today. So the Chalmers area of advance, I should say, is a cross-departmental organization who works in collaboration also with local industry to promote specific areas where Chalmers are strong in research. One such area is AI, of course. Recent advances in AI, especially generative tools like ChatGPT, Midjourney for image generation, and AlphaFold for protein analysis, are transforming our society. It will have impacts on the economy, on the labor market, and beyond, and we'll all see the effects. Already now, realistic fake images and fake videos are spreading disinformation around elections and in the news. In addition, a lot of the data that's been used to train these models has been downloaded from the internet without any regard to privacy or copyright. So what we see now is a number of lawsuits popping up trying to challenge this. What can be used to train AI models and what not? And also, will this automation really be good enough? Or will it just be a customer service chatbot that's just going to be yet another source of annoyance and frustration and not answer your question, although it will do so very politely? And how can we ensure that the potential of all these AI systems is used to benefit human prosperity rather than just automating away jobs? And how do we avoid all the risks that come with this development, like unemployment and disinformation? So today we have a great program with different perspectives on these questions from our three invited speakers. So the first speaker is Ruschemeier, who comes from law and she will provide a perspective on the legislation and regulations. Next up, we have the MIT economist, Daron Acemoglu, who will examine how technology and AI in particular interact with economy and society. Daron Acemoglu has been, for instance, in the discussion around the Nobel Prize in Economy many times, so we're very excited to have him here, although remotely. And finally, we also have a talk by Shalom Lappin, who comes from the natural language processing community and will provide a technical perspective on large language models and what the next generation of AI technology might look like. And to finish off the day, we will have a panel discussion, wrapping up what we've been talking about and some reflections of the day. But don't leave after that. We will also have a little mingle with some drinks and nibbles out in the restaurant at the end of the day, so please continue the discussions there. Now, before I introduce the first speaker, I should also do some housekeeping. So we have a quite tight schedule. You can see it at the wall behind you. And unfortunately, we will only be able to take questions from the audience in the room, not from the online participants. And I will also ask you to think up your questions in advance, keep them brief and concise and clear to allow as many people as possible to ask their questions. There was a slight change in the schedules. If you read it a number of weeks ago, you will notice there's a slight change, but you find it displayed both at the back and outside. And I should also say that there will be some photos taken during the day. So if you don't want to be in these photos, you should email the email address that you will find on the seminar web page. Now I've been talking a lot, so now I'm going to introduce our first speaker. So Hannah Ruschemeier is a junior professor of public law, data protection law, and law of the digital transformation at the Faculty of Law at the University of Hagen in Germany, where she's been working since 2022. She has previously held positions at the Center for Advanced Internet Studies, working on projects about how AI is used in the state and public administration, and about ethical, legal, and societal issues in digitalization. She's also a board member of the Robotics and AI Law Society and a co-editor of the journal Legal Tech. So I hope you will all join me to welcome Hannah, please.
Let me set my timer. We lawyers love to talk, and I don't want to spoil your coffee break. Okay, Moa, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm super honored to be here. Should I just start? We're a bit early, that's okay? Okay, great, 5 more minutes. Super. Today I will talk about the normative challenges of AI regulation. And by normative challenges, I refer to legal and ethical challenges. I'm a public lawyer, so I'm not a computer scientist. Please be nice to me when I talk about technical things. But I think an interdisciplinary approach is very important when we talk about this topic. So I'm particularly happy to speak in front of a more technical educated audience today at a technical university. So this is the table of contents. I will start talking about AI to avoid talking about AI, and I will explain in a minute why is that. I will continue with my thesis that regulating AI is about regulating power, continue with questions of power as questions of the rule of law, and then I will finish with some updates on the AI Act and the DSA, so references to the current European legislation of AI. And if we have time for a conclusion, I may not only talk about the challenges, but only about some potential solutions for the normative challenges of AI. All right, so talking about AI to avoid talking about AI. I'm a public lawyer and a legal scholar, and of course my perspective is highly influenced from European law and also from German fundamental rights dogmatics, stuff like that. But I think most of the arguments can be transferred to the regulation of AI internationally, but I will specifically refer to European legislation at the end of my talk. Why talking about AI to avoid talking about AI? Well, from a legal point of view, the hype theme AI is not a good fit when it comes to legal regulation, because AI as a regulatory object is a nightmare. We need clear definitions, we need borders, we need differences between regulatory objects. AI is not a good definition. I wrote some papers about this, why AI is a challenge for legal regulation and why AI is not a good subject, but the European Commission, unfortunately, did not follow me, so we have the AI Act by now. I will not talk about the specific risks of AI today, since there's excellent research from other people on it, and I think you all heard about the AI scandals, the AI risks, the incidents from ChatGPT and other programs, so I will leave this out. But this is the basis of my thesis. There are risks and not only benefits of AI that are very important to society. So, what is AI anyway, from my understanding? So I brought these 3 starting points for you. From my point of view, AI is not a technology, but it's a socio-technical development. And I think the success of AI is a story of capitalist logic, systematic legal violations, and a lack of regulation. This is why we need regulation more than ever. And the third thesis is that the challenges of AI are the challenges of utilizing, extracting, and generating data. So I think, rather than focusing on the technical advantages or technical specifications of AI, from a normative perspective, we should talk about the socio-technical implications. And we have to look at the power structures. This is why it's important to understand that the actors behind AI have very specific economic interests they're following up. So, referring to the third point, I think we should rather talk about data than talking about AI. The first point. So, what are the socio-technical implications of AI? You see this graphic that illustrates the socio-technical systems theory. And it illustrates that technology is not isolated or even neutral, but it relates to other points like goals, metrics, people, infrastructure, technology, culture, processes, and procedures, and they are intertwined with each other, so they cannot be separated. What's the specifics of AI as a socio-technical system and humans, for example? AI needs humans because AI needs data. And who produces this data? Us, all of us. All of us provide data for AI. And this is why AI has become so successful, because the connection of AI and humans have been close from the very beginning. The interfaces of the apps, websites, and other applications you use today are specifically designed to keep you on there, to scroll further, to leave more data with this specific provider, because you're seen as data producers. And all these data producers, all these human data producers are needed to make AI so successful, because AI is trained on data. So, AI and human data labor work is closely interconnected. And this leads me back to the socio-technical systems theory. It was established by the Institute of London Tavistock Labour Studies in the 1950s. And until then, the technology was regarded as an independent, more or less autonomous variable. And this reminds me of the discussion about AI today. But AI is not, as presented in the discussion, only an isolated groundbreaking technology, but it's highly dependent on human beings. So it's not something that is an autonomous influence we cannot stop. we provide all the data that the AI is running on. So us and AI are closely connected with each other. So my point is, the success story of AI today is highly relevant for the understanding of how humans produce data in using digital technologies. So the success story is AI is not only based on parallel processing or GPUs or something like that, but to the provision of big data via human beings. This is fostered by applications, for example, who provide nudges to stay longer on the website. There are these dark patterns that make it hard to find the cancel button on the website. And now you produce more and more data every day. So this is the aspect of the socio-technical system between the humans and the infrastructure and the technology of AI. My second point is, why is AI a story about capitalism? The photo you see on the slide out there was taken at the AI UK summit, and it shows Rishi Sunak and Elon Musk under the logo X. This is the company of Mr. Musk that you're maybe aware of. So, AI has become so successful because a few private actors, which are highly influential, which are on the world stages, talking to political leaders of European democracies, profit from it. And you may are familiar with the book Surveillance Capitalism. So Susanna Zuboff has described this surveillance capitalism, which is highly relevant for data, as surveillance, the claiming of human behavior as raw material for the conversion of behavioral data, which is then, in turn, commercialized. And this is what the powerful actors are doing today. So, the influence of AI leaders is based on the influence in the capitalist world. The other aspect of human labor in relationship to AI is a rather analog one. I'm talking about click work. You saw this on the second slide where I was talking about the AI risks. AI is not purely digital. It's not only relies on the human data labor, but on the analog real labor of human beings, typically performed in the global south. So in the capitalist logic, large digital companies outsource click labor like flagging of data, content moderation, analogous work that humans have to do in the global south. So this is where people get exploited for the success of AI. And all the current AI applications, the platforms, the large language models, etc., rely on this analog labor of real human beings. And this is also very coherent with the capitalist logic that made AI so successful. The third point are the systemic violations. As you can see here, the companies like Meta and also OpenAI admitted that having to pay billions for training data would have ruined their generative AI plans as they fight new copyright rules. You mentioned the ongoing lawsuits today. There are a couple of lawsuits in the US, not in Europe yet, but we have similar problems with copyright violations, with privacy violations of large language models. Large language models are just the most current example of systemic violations of the law and individual rights of others. Why do they have become so successful and so good? Because they scrape their training data from nearly the whole internet without caring about consent of data subjects or other individuals, without caring about compliance with copyright provisions, etc. Even before the large language models, the European Court of Justice recently ruled last year that the business model of Meta, formerly Facebook, cannot be operated in compliance with the GDPR. However, this business model is what has made the company so successful in the first place, and they knew this. So these specific private actors operate along their motto, move fast and break things, and don't care about regulation. Otherwise, they would not have been so successful. So these business models, their business model, Yeah, they are based on structural violations of law. This is a problem because for democracies, it's essential that we follow the assumption that behavior in accordance with the law is the rule and not the exception. Because force is a very limited in democracies. You cannot enforce every infringement of legal rights, of legal provisions. So if we have these powerful actors who systemically violate laws with their business models, which are inherently connected with the violation of existing laws, this is a problem for democracy and the rule of law in the first place. The last slide in this section is about the datafication. So I brought you some numbers here. And I cannot wrap my head around this because the numbers are just too big. This is a statistics about the volume of data and information which was created, captured, copied, and consumed worldwide from 2022 to 2022, including forecasts up until 2021. And the important thing on this slide is it's in zettabytes. So this is a huge, large number you cannot really imagine. I think it's beyond the borders of the human brain, but these are immense amounts of data. So we have the datafication of our everyday lives, which AI is profiting from, meaning everything can be data right now. Your emotions, emotional detections, your behavior, your location, everything is translated into data, leading to datafication, which can be commercialized. So, what does this have to do with the rule of law and with my first thesis that regulating AI is about regulating power? I want to talk about some varieties of power in this section. I will talk about data power, I will talk about epistemic power, and I will start with data power. So data power, from my point of view, is a manifestation of a special form of informational power asymmetry, which is made up of the players involved, market dominance, and knowledge production. So, let's have a look at the actors, the interests they pursue, their technical possibilities, their market dominance, and their knowledge production. As you can see on the slide, the article says, are you ready? Here is all the data Facebook and Google have on you. And these actors who accumulate these large amount of data about individuals make them very powerful because they can predict your next move, right? They can predict what product you want to buy. They can predict what song you want to listen to, even maybe before you know it. They can predict what kind of diseases you have, even before you know it. There is research on this clinical trial advertisement on Facebook, where they developed an algorithm which of their users respond to clinical trial advertisements, which in fact gives Facebook the possibility to predict via this algorithm, which was originally used for advertising for clinical trials, but now Facebook has the algorithm to predict whether you have diabetes or not. This is a manifestation of data power. It's also relational, because the power asymmetry relates to different actors. Who doesn't have data power? The users. Do you know what data Facebook and Google have on you? We don't. And even if we would know or download all these 10,000s of pages that you can request from them, we wouldn't understand. And the other aspect of the asymmetry is you cannot use your data in the same way these companies do. They can commercialize it because they have huge amount of data. So it's not about the individual anymore, it's about mass data. So even if you say, okay, I want to sell my medical history for an AI model, can I make money from it? You won't. Because your personal data is not important anymore. It's only important in the training data set that these companies has, where they put it in relation to other users. So data power is the manifestation of this informal power asymmetry. This is closely related to economic power. On this slide, you see the list of the very large online platforms and very large search engines that are now regulated under the Digital Services Act of the EU. So the Digital Services Act addresses the goal of creating a safe and trustworthy internet environment by putting special obligations to specific powerful players. And you all know every actor on this slide. So, the economic power means that these actors establish market power through their databases, their technology, and of course, scaling. Why are networks successful? They are successful when they have lots of users. And so far, competition law has not been able to contain data power effectively. Because the EU provisions on competition law, they can be found in Article 101 and 102 in the Treaty of the European Union, only focus on an ex post regulation of the abuse of a dominant market position. The problem with these actors you see on the slide is that they do not always abuse the dominant market position, because network effects alone do not establish the abuse of a dominant market position. Also, there is no real competition between networks. There is maybe a competition between networks for like business partners who sell their advertising spots there. But there's no competition from the point of view of the users. Because if you are in a network where your friends and family is, you don't want to change the network. There's no real competition to it, right? So this is described as networks effects. Also, users cannot compare prices for offers that are not based on monetary compensation. And this, again, refers to the datafication and the production of the human data production. Nothing on the internet is free. You always pay with your data, but there's no price tag on it. So this makes it very hard for users to compare this from an economical point of view. And the example from the DSA is why networks are not in competition with each other. If you look at the slide, you will not use Instagram to book a hotel, or you will not use Wikipedia to upload your short dance video, for example. So as you can see, the structures of competition law are not very fitting anymore when it comes to the economic power I refer to as data power. There is hope. The German Federal Cartel Office prohibited Facebook from combining user data from different sources. This is an old case from 2019. I'm talking about this now because the European Court of Justice confirmed this decision. And why is this so extraordinary? Because they referred to the systemic violation of data protection law in a competition law case. This is new. Usually, the thought behind competition law was to ensure the freeing flow of the market, maybe also protecting consumers, but this was very indirect. But now, in the case of the digital economy, it's very important that these things are intertwined. So I think this is an important step in the right direction from a legal point of view, to consider the systemic violations and the data power in the assessment of competition law. The second variety of data power is what we call in formal publications prediction power. AI can make everything relevant. We live in a prediction society. Because before the rise of LLMs, the most popular use cases of AI and machine learning models were predictive models. You can predict a credit scoring, the risk of you getting diabetes, what you're going to buy next, etc. These are all predictive models. They drew inferences from input data and come up with a probability. So this is statistics, right? But AI now can make everything relevant, including the things you thought they would never be relevant. If you're using a Mac or a PC, or what website you visited before that, or what you liked on Facebook. So this means that there are no unimportant data anymore in the age of the prediction society. And this, of course, closely refers to the mentioning of power and to the relevant actors. Because who has the prediction power? These companies who accumulate all the data. And if they want to use it in a way that's economically interesting to them, they can predict everything. So I think the most absurd example was that the choice of your browser may affect your job prospects, right? And it doesn't matter that these inferences are right or not, even if they are like technically right or not biased or whatever. This is a problem, because I think it's important that we do not predict everything. I don't want to live in a society where everything is predictable. Mariel Hildebrand, a legal scholar from the Netherlands, referred to this as freezing the future. So this affects your autonomy. If you're under the impression that your every move that creates behavior data that then will be commercialized after this can affect what your job chances are, your future will be freezed. This is also a loss of autonomy, right? I mean, your range, what your future behavior will get closer. Also, there is this high risk of discrimination and inequality, of course. There are a lot of works on this, that when there is biased data and etc., people who are already discriminated are discriminated more by the use of algorithms. So this is very important. But even if these predictions are right, I don't think it's always from a democratic point of view, it's right to use them, right? We don't want anything to be predictable. Because the inherent idea of the law is that people can change. They can change their will and they can change their actions. If the algorithm predicts what you're going to do in the future, whether you will be able to pay the credit back, whether you will perform good at your job, whether you will get sick or not connected to your behavior, you don't have the chance to change anymore. The third aspect is epistemic power. AI highly influences knowledge production and perception. The example you see on the slide there is a research about the manipulation effects of search engines and their possible impact on the outcomes of elections. Also, there are other varieties of epistemic power I want to get into now. So, this is from the Stanford AI Index report from 2023. And on the slide, you can see the number of significant machine learning systems by sector in a range of 20 years, from 2002 to 2022. As you can see, academia was quite good back in the days. But now, if you look at private industry, and especially at the gap between academia and private industry in the last 10 years, this has become significant. This also means that the people we are talking about now, the regulators, are the only ones who know what is actually regulated, because they have all the epistemic power, because they have all the significant machine learning systems. So this is important to keep in mind when we talk about power asymmetries. We do not have only have the informational asymmetries between the platforms and the users. We also have the informational asymmetries between the regulators and the regulatees, because the regulatory object, AI or machine learning models I was talking about in the first place, is in the hands of the industry. This could lead to what we called epistemic capture. If you look at AI journal publications, on this slide, you see the influence of knowledge production. These are scientific contributions. So, as you may remember, scientific expertise knowledge is highly demanded when it comes to regulatory areas that are perceived as technical. During the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, politicians were highly referring to experts from medicine, virology, etc., because it was a technical regulatory object. We have the same when it comes to AI regulation. And who are they are relying on? Well, to the people who contribute to the production of knowledge in this field. So the contributions of the research departments of global tech companies, Microsoft, Google, OpenAI, they all have their own research areas, exploded in the last years. So I think combined with that, the regulatory object of the machine learning models is in the hand of the industry, and the contributions to the knowledge production from a scientific point of view is significant. And you can really narrow it down to a handful of actors who are very active there. So as you can see, of course, these actors make critical contributions on socio-technical harms of algorithmic systems. But as you may remember, the case of Timnit Gebru, who was fired from Google or let go or whatever, because of the paper they did not want her to publish, this is highly influenced by the economic interest of these companies. And actually the name of the paper Timnit was let go for was Stochastic Parrots. Can large language models be too big? I think this is very important for our discussion today, and we are talking about a paper back from 2018. So a lot of people in Google research knew what was coming, they just didn't want anyone else to know. So I'm very critical when it comes to the knowledge production and the contributions to academic publishing when it comes from private companies. Now, why are these questions of power questions of the rule of law? You may wonder, she's talking about power and all this scientific stuff all the time. She's a lawyer. What does it have to do with that? So if you look at the actors that are involved in the system of a rule of law, it's very important to look at the relationships between them. Of course, we have the state, we have the citizens, and we have the private actors. The state has an obligation to protect its citizens, right? The state also has an obligation to provide and control infrastructures, which are more and more taken over by private actors. Private actors and citizens between each other have relationships under private law. There has been a discussion in the legal sphere to directly bind private actors that are very powerful, state-like actors, to fundamental rights. But I think this is very complicated and wrong. So the relations between citizens and private actors are relations under private law. But what it makes more complicated, private actors, for example, in the case of platforms, they have a factual norm-setting power. They are setting norms, and this creates a normative concurrency or parallelism towards the norms of the state. Because what's important when somebody deletes your post on Facebook? Not if it was illegal or not, you can fight this out in a court like months later, but your post is deleted anyway. So who sets the norms for deleting the post or the moderation of the content? The private actors do. So we have a parallelism between norms set by the state and norms set by the private actors. This is problematic, of course. From my understanding, the rule of law, and this is the connection to the regulation of power, legitimizes power in equal measure to control. Because the other side of exuberant non-state power is the diminished authority of the controlling and democratically legitimized institutions represented by the state actors. Also, power is not a static property, but a relational phenomena. Therefore, you have to look at the relationship of the actors I showed you before. It cannot, therefore, be exclusive to one actor. Rather, it emerges in relations to other actors, making it inherently structural. The challenges for the rule of law lie in the structural enforcement deficits of norms set by the state. I mentioned the example of ChatGPT before. ChatGPT is not and will never be in compliance with data protection law. We may have to change data protection law, but it just cannot be compliant with the GDPR because they scrape the whole internet, making no differences between the categories of personal data, non-personal data, or individual data subjects. Yeah? This leads to the point that normative categories of the state set norms no longer fit anymore, because it's just not the reality of large machine learning models that they distinguish between different kinds of data. Also, sorry for the computer scientist, if you look at the functioning of a predictive model, this is just from my legal point of view. We can have non-personal data from training data subjects as an input that leads to the prediction of personal data of other data subjects. And this is just not compatible with the categories of law at all, because we have a fixation of the individual protection of fundamental rights, right? The protection of the individual is a cornerstone of European fundamental rights protection. The individual just is not important anymore in these models. It's about mass data. So the GDPR says you as an individual data subject have a right to erase your data. But the data subjects from the input data and the inference of the model, the prediction, what your credit score is, whatever, are not the same. So the individual data subjects from the training data subject or the data subjects of the inference are not leading everywhere when it comes to controlling predictive models. Last point here, the controlling of infrastructures. We have researched how the decisions by Apple and Google obstruct app privacy. They did not favor privacy-sensitive apps in their own platform stores because they were in competition with their more privacy-invasive own apps. And the last example is the COVID-19 app that was very popular in Germany. It was an open source project, actually, so I think the execution was a good one. But it was only that successful because Google and Apple agreed to launch it in their app stores. Otherwise, the state could not have done it that way. And this leads to the question of digital sovereignty. Do we still have digital sovereignty as a state if we highly rely on these infrastructures of public actors? All right, let me talk a few minutes about the AI Act and the DSA. So there is something happening with legal regulation on the European level. The AI Act was agreed on, I think, in an hours-long marathon of negotiations at the mid-December in Brussels. And now all the member states announced that they will vote for the AI Act and the final decision of the European Parliament in April. So the AI Act does not address all of the issues I talked about here today. Actually, it addresses very less of them. The AI Act is a risk-based regulatory regime. There are prohibited AI systems, high-risk AI systems, low-risk AI systems, and AI systems with limited risks. And the high-risk use cases are listed in this Annex 3. For example, insurance scoring, credit scoring, AI systems for educational purposes, for public services, etc. Yeah? From its regulatory structure, the AI Act is highly influenced by product safety law, which means it's not a regime that protects fundamental rights, even if they say so. They say one of the purposes in the recitals is to ensure a high level of protection of health, safety, and fundamental rights enshrined in the Charter, which includes democracy, rule of law, and environmental protection. I think this is a step in the right direction, but I'm seeing very less of these goals in the actual provisions of the AI Act. Another new regulatory approach is that it's now possible to test high-risk AI systems in regulatory sandboxes and also outside. This is a concept known from computer science, but now it's set up as a regulatory test setting. But AI systems also can be tested outside these regulatory sandboxes, which was a claim of the industry because they did not want to necessarily engage with a regulatory body. There was a lot of discussion about the fundamental rights impact assessment. There was an open letter from law professors that asked the parliament to include a fundamental rights impact assessment in the AI Act. It's in there now. It's extremely weak. The other hot topic of the political discussions were the prohibitions on biometric face identifications. Biometric face identifications are now under the list of prohibited practices, but there are wide exceptions for law enforcement. So I think this provision will be rather toothless. The fundamental right impact assessment is totally weakened now because it has a very limited scope. Only public bodies as deployers of AI systems or private actors that provide public services, and in high-risk cases that the Annex 3, 5b and CA is referring to, these are insurance risk assessments and credit scorings, even fall under the scope of the fundamental rights impact assessment. So this is not a horizontal provision, but its scope is rather limited. Also, if a data protection impact assessment, which has not done anything for AI regulation or the limiting of AI risk by now, is carried out, the fundamental right impact assessment is not necessary or has to be carried out in conjunction with the data protection impact assessment, or can be even replaced by the latter. So this is like very weak. My last point is, and this was in the last round of political negotiations that were highly influenced by the AI lobby, Germany and France were at the forefront on prohibiting obligations for open source and general purpose AI, because we have now one German AI company who developed general purpose AI, and the French model Mixtral, so they wanted to keep these provisions out there. Now there are obligations for general purpose AI models, which are mainly the industry standards that are already in place by now. And there are large exceptions for open source. This is maybe a point for the discussion. I think from the regulatory approach of the AI Act, from a legal point of view, I don't see a reason why open source models cannot pose the risk that the AI Act wants to address, but they are exempted from the provisions. When it comes to general purpose AI, additional provisions only apply for general purpose models that pose systemic risks. Systemic risks are associated with models that are over a certain compute threshold of the number I put on the slide, floating operation points, or the individual decision of the Commission. So let's see how this goes. I think enforcement of the AI Act will be crucial. And I finish here with the conclusion that not all hope is lost. If you want to check my current publications, we propose some systemic solutions that go beyond the protection of individual rights. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hannah. We have 4 minutes for a couple of quick questions.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for the great presentation. Just a quick question: how can governments account for the digital divide regarding digital discrimination and digital exclusion between the marginalised in society?
Okay, thank you very much. Tough question. So, what to do about the digital divide and digital discrimination? From my point of view, these are two different topics. I understand the digital divide as the fact that some people are online using digital services and some people are not. Is that your understanding as well?
So if you go to the job centre, where I'm from in the UK, or Arbetsförmedlingen in Sweden, they're now starting to use AI services to help with applications, etc., and make decision-making processes. People who aren't digitally literate don't know about this. So
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I think then. So yeah, digital literacy is important. Okay, so the easy answer would be we have to invest in digital education. Of course, I think we should still do this, but even people who are digital experts or like educated about digital applications still don't understand if AI is used in the job center, I think. So at first, this is a matter of transparency. Yeah, I mean, you have to make it transparent that you're using an AI system and that you're talking to a chatbot and not a human being when it comes to public services. The second thing is, I think we should critically check whether we should use AI systems for this kind of public services in the first place. There's the case of the Austrian Arbeitsmarktservice-Algorithmus, where they used the scoring algorithm to decide whether people should get support in finding jobs. It was horrible because they ticked all the boxes of a bad algorithm and nobody knew about, right? They used like very old historical data. It was highly discriminatory. You get 5 points lower when you're a woman, not even talking about intersectional stuff and whatever. So we need transparency. We need rigid quality control, right? At the moment, there is no quality control for AI systems and the use of public services. Let's see what the provisions of the AI Act do for that. But I think we even need stricter provisions when it comes to public goods and the use of AI systems in the public sector.
Thank you. I think we actually don't have time for any more questions, but if you do have more questions, please save them for the discussion later in the afternoon. I would like to hand over a small gift to Hannah.
Thank you very much.
Chalmers have made a donation in your name to UNICEF and their program that's called School in a Box. It's an educational program via UNICEF.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we now have a 20-minute coffee break. So you find some coffee out where you got lunch. And then at 3 o'clock, please be back for the next talk. Thank you.
Okay. So are we live? Okay. I thought I'd see something here. Okay, welcome back then, everyone. My name is Henrik Berglund. I'm a professor of entrepreneurship and strategy at the Department of Technology Management and Economics here at Chalmers. And I'm here to introduce our next speaker, who is Daron Acemoglu, who is the Elizabeth and James Killian Institute Professor of Economics at MIT. Daron, as was mentioned before, is a very prominent economist who's won numerous awards, published incredible amounts of papers, and also published several books. The last one being Power and Progress, Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity, which I read in the last few weeks, and I can strongly recommend it. He's also well read, as you can see by more than 230,000 scholars citing his work. So we're really pleased to have Daron here. Daron, I would say, is a political economist in kind of the classical sense, both on the micro and macro level. He's very interested in the closely intertwined issues of social norms and social organization, technology, law and legal issues like we talked about before. And I think as a result of that, he is a very good choice of economist to have us join for this discussion today. So with that, please, Daron.
Thank you very much, Henrik. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Perfect. So, and now, can you see my full screen?
We can see you right now.
Okay.
Here we go. Now we see your screen.
Okay. Perfect. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's my pleasure to talk about themes related to the book that Henrik, you mentioned, Power and Progress. But I want to go beyond the book, which was published about a year ago, and I want to sort of be a little bit more forward-looking in my concerns and my thoughts. And so I'm going to talk about redesigning AI. Essentially, the title here suggests that there is something wrong in the way that we are focusing on AI right now, and there are steps that we need to take. So that's what I'm going to try to explain. I'll spend less time on the history than I would if I was giving a talk on the book or the broader economic issues, but I think this is potentially of interest and hopefully something that we can also discuss. So we have an hour, or now less than an hour. So I was hoping to be finished in about 35 minutes, and then that will leave us about 20 minutes for discussion. So I don't think I need to show much evidence of a AI type revolution, at least in terms of enthusiasm, writing, spending, use of AI that has really skyrocketed over the last decade, essentially. And one place where you see that, and I think very relevant for some of the issues that we're going to talk about, is that these models are now of increasing and computational power. So you see GPT-4 and Gemini Ultra, which are estimated to be trained using computational power of 10 billion petaflops, which is just an incredible number. One petaflop is 1,000 trillion floating point operations per second. The most powerful MacBook Pro can perform 100 of a petaflop about a day. The training of GPT, as I said, involves more than 10 billion petaflops, and Gemini probably more than that. So these are really the apex of capital spending in some sense, and this is not unique. Already AlphaGo, AlphaZero, some of these famous programs were already huge, but the new ones have become much huger. And demand for AI skills is growing rapidly and everywhere over the last 10 years, most strongly in the United States, but pretty much everywhere for which we have data, for example, on skills in job postings, so we can trace where AI skills are coming from. And there are aspects of this AI revolution that should indeed be quite inspiring. leaving aside some of the claims made in the literature, and I'll come back to some of them, such as artificial general intelligence, I think the true promise of generative AI is intelligent, flexible, and easily usable tools that are complementary to human decision making. So I'll try to explain why that's actually quite an interesting prospect and a real one. But what I'm going to talk about right now is that there are economic, technical, and political economy barriers to this promise being realized. And in fact, we are probably going in quite the opposite direction of this promise. And that's the argument for the potential for redesigning AI. And I'm going to talk about 4 major roadblocks: excessive focus on automation, loss of informational diversity, the wrong type of human AI misalignment, but I'll explain that by that I don't mean the sort of the alignment problem that is sometimes mentioned in the context of artificial general intelligence. I actually mean something quite different, and I think much more important, I would argue, and monopolization of control of information. And I think these are industry level challenges, but they are embedded in a broader political economy and in the broader visions or aspirations of the tech industry. And I don't think we can understand our current moment and the ways in which this potential is developed and being wasted without recognizing that from the very beginning of the computer era, there were 2 separate, distinct, and in some sense opposed visions of what we want from computers and from artificial intelligence. The first one, which is today much more dominant in the industry and in academia, unfortunately, goes back to this brilliant gentleman, Alan Turing, a truly inspiring figure whose work, mathematical work, some of you may know, and whose fame, of course, you know from Hollywood movies. He was a brilliant mathematician and a philosopher, and very innovative, but his philosophical ideas, I think, ultimately pushed us in the wrong direction. And the most important one of those was the way in which how human brain worked and how computers can emulate and do better than the human brain. And this was the origin of the idea that Alan Turing proposed, which he called autonomous machine intelligence, meaning machines being intelligent, doing high-level capabilities, developing high-level capabilities, but at the same time autonomous, meaning that they could do so in a self-acting way without supervision of humans. And this was very much both by the first generation of people who started working on AI, for example, the Dartmouth 1956 AI project, which is where the artificial intelligence label was introduced. And they were very much all in on this idea that what we want from computers, and the most advanced computers, which they thought would take the form of artificial intelligence, is autonomous machine intelligence. This wasn't the only view. Very much from the beginning, actually, a few years after Turing, Norbert Wiener, an MIT mathematician and an engineer, who's also famous if you are into engineering or Brownian motion type mathematics, and had already articulated a very different vision of what we want from computers. And this was the basis of both his philosophical writings and some of his more general writings, for example, on cybernetics. It was critically about machines being at the service of humans. So Simon Johnson and I call this machine usefulness to contrast with machine intelligence. This is the reason why, for example, Norbert Wiener put so much emphasis on information science, because that was, for him, the way for computers or machines and humans to communicate. And this wasn't just at the level of mathematics and philosophy. People like Douglas Engelbart, for example, in the 1950s and 1960s, made this a true innovation agenda. He invented some of the technologies that I think are the most significant ones in the computer age, and that are completely part of our lives. The computer mice, hyperlink, hypertext, menu-driven computers, and his students were at the forefront of all of the innovations that later became part of smartphones and menu-driven computers and so on and so forth. J.C.R. Licklider, another engineer, very much thought that the real promise of computers was in providing information to humans, which he called human-machine symbiosis. And this was actually part of his work, and part of his funding was critical for the early version of the internet to develop. So these two visions are, of course, can be complementary at times, but are actually fundamentally different. And the second one emphasizes much more how we can use computers, and especially now much more capable computers with these flexibility that generative AI is showing, in the service of humans, while the latter is very much creating a direct path from the computer technology investments into automation, because autonomous machines can do things as well as humans, and to the current craze about artificial general intelligence. And in fact, there are reasons for being excited about generative AI precisely in our current economic turning point, because you know, a lot of human activity in the past was related to war making and physical work in agriculture and first industry. And today we have a significant growth in knowledge work. And by knowledge work, I don't just mean white collar work, but work that uses information over various forms. So according to this definition, a lot of production work today is knowledge work, because if an electrician comes and tries to troubleshoot problems in your house when your electrical wiring doesn't work, that's knowledge work. And when an artist works, that's knowledge work. And many blue-collar workers that are engaged in design, innovation, maintenance, and inspection are also engaged in knowledge work. And if you look at the U.S. economy, for example, you see that a lot of new jobs is actually coming from things that are associated with knowledge work, a variety of new tasks that have emerged since 1940 that are concentrated in activities that are intertwined with information. So the promise of generative AI here is that it can be a partner to human work and provide better information to humans. An irony of our current age is not only that knowledge work has become more important, but that we have abundant information. So pretty much anything that is being written about, you can find on the internet, but useful information is scarce in the sense that if you need some information about performing a specific task, for example, discovering why is it that your electrical system is not working, or your computer is malfunctioning, or how to solve a new creative problem, that useful information is scarce because you cannot locate it. Generative AI can be thought of as an information filtering system. It can actually provide for humans better information or new tools for them to get better in knowledge work. And this is, in fact, actually what J.C.R. Licklider, whom I mentioned as the pioneer of the internet, had already anticipated more than 60 years ago. In an article which he called Man-Computer Symbiosis, he called the hope is that in not too many years, human brains and computing machines will be coupled together very tightly, and that the resulting partnership will think as no human brain has ever thought, and process data in a way that not approached by the information handling machines we know today. So, what's very remarkable here is that he's using language that's very much distinct from the autonomous machine intelligence. He's not talking about human brains becoming supplemented or machines doing better than humans, but he's talking about human brains becoming better. And by symbiosis, of course, he doesn't mean biological symbiosis. He means informational symbiosis. Is this completely sort of a pipe dream? And I have been sort of brainwashed by some propaganda in the AI industry that says that this will happen while they're actually working on automation and more digital ads. Well, there is some of it that some of what I've just said may actually be sometimes thrown around as an obfuscation strategy by the AI industry, but I don't think it is completely a pipe dream. And in fact, there are several recent studies using foundation models, especially OpenAI's ChatGPT, that show that when prompted in the right way and used in the right way, generative AI can be useful for human decision making. None of those are revolutionary, meaning that they are very small proof of concept illustrations, but they are interesting. So, for example, this paper by Sida Peng, Mert Demirer, and co-authors, shows how software engineers that have access to GitHub Copilot, which is a ChatGPT or GPT-4 based tool that writes first draft computer program in a number of common languages such as Java or Python, they can be twice as fast. Some of them can be twice as fast. On average, about 30% as fast, but those that have middling levels of skills, so they're not so good that they were able to do everything by themselves very quickly, they can actually increase their speed about twice as much. Same thing for white-collar tasks in offices is shown by my students, Shiket Noy and Whitney Zhang. They show that having access to ChatGPT for summarizing and doing simple writing tasks increases productivity by about 30%, and by Eric Brynjolfsson, Daniel Lee, and Lindsay Raymond for customer service tasks. And in all of these, there is evidence that the benefits come from workers that have middling levels of expertise, meaning that if I take somebody who has no information about programming and I put them into Peng et al. Study, that won't be any good because the GitHub Copilot never writes good, perfect code. You have to debug it. You have to understand what it's doing and why it's not doing exactly what you want, and then you can sort of build on it. But if you're the very best software programmer, you can still do much better than the machine. So it's the people with the middling levels of expertise. And you see the same thing in the Noy and Zhang study. So here is the blue, in green is the treatment group from their study, and in black it's the control group. So the people who don't have access to the ChatGPT based ChatGPT model have much greater inequality in the quality of their writing output. So essentially, it's really the people who are performing at low levels, even though they are still fairly expert in this task. So that's why I'm calling them middling. So they are the ones who are benefiting. And if you're the very best, you're not getting any gain from these ChatGPT-based models. So that's the promise. Are we likely to get there? And my answer is no, not at all in the current path. And in fact, the current path is very pernicious. And there are a number of reasons for it that are not sufficiently emphasized. And I want to spend the rest of my my talk discussing those a little bit, and just giving a roadmap. It's excessive automation rather than input into human decision making, loss of informational diversity, misalignment, and monopolized control of information. So what do I mean by those? Well, so let me actually show the contrast to the Noy Zhang or the other studies that I pointed out, which show actually you can help workers with lower levels of expertise or skill in terms of providing them help or information. Well, the recent changes in many countries, especially in the US, don't look anything like that. So here I'm illustrating that by showing the evolution of real wages by 10 demographic groups, men and women, and by education level, going all the way from workers with no high school degree in orange, workers with a high school degree, 2-year colleges, 4-year colleges, no postgraduate degree, and postgraduate degree. You see in the 1960s, and using different data sources, you can see the same thing in the 1950s as well. These curves are on top of each other. There's very rapid wage growth, about 2.5% a year inflation adjusted. So that's a really striking rate of economic growth. In 20 years, essentially, you're doubling your real income. And it was shared prosperity because all groups, men and women and different education groups, were benefiting from it. But look at the digital age, starting sometime around 1980, and you see a complete sea change. Workers with postgraduate degrees, women with postgraduate and college degrees are essentially still increasing their real wages, but all other groups are stagnant, or in the case of low education groups, really declining. This is a very significant decline. Nothing like this has been seen in US history, where a demographic group experiences such significant declines in real wages while the economy is growing for an extended period of time. Now, you might think that this has many reasons, and it does. Globalization, changes in institutions, changes in norms, but automation is singly important, as I've tried to argue, for example, in my work with Pascual Restrepo. So here's a figure summarizing part of that work. So what I'm doing here is that I'm shifting the focus from the 10 demographic groups I showed you in the previous slide to more detailed demographic groups. So each one of those circles is a demographic group distinguished by gender, education, age, and ethnicity. The color coding shows the education level. And I'm looking at that critical period that I showed you from here, from 1980 to 2016, 2017. So here I have on the vertical axis the cumulative change in their hourly real wages from 1980 to 2016, 2017. This is the zero here, and you see that many groups are below the zero. These are the ones that are experiencing real wage declines as the economy is growing. And on the horizontal axis, I include Pasquale Restrepo and my estimate of how much automation these groups have been subjected to. A lot of this is pre-AI, but still interesting. And what this number loosely corresponds to is what's the fraction of tasks that demographic group used to perform in 1980 that have since been automated by software, by advanced machinery or robotics. And you see a remarkable relationship, a very strong negative relationship. And in fact, most of this between group inequality and a lot of the declines in the real wages is due to automation. So focus on automation has been not so good for workers. Why? Because it has not been associated with new tasks, new information, new capabilities for workers. Just to focus on automation is not a recipe for shared prosperity. Now, this is not unique to the digital age. That's the topic of my book with Simon Johnson, that throughout history we see exactly the same pattern, that some of the most important effects of technology are related to who controls technology and whether they use it for automation or not. When it was used for automation, for example, at the first 100 years of the Industrial Revolution, it led to real wage declines, very worse conditions for a large fraction of the population. And it took a very major changes in political reform, labor organization, and redirection of technology to reverse that. So there's no automatic correction mechanism such that you'll do a lot of automation and ultimately the market mechanism itself is going to sort of correct that. And we don't know for generative AI, except for newspaper reports and qualitative reports and some of my conversations with technology insiders. But my sense would be that generative AI right now is going in a very heavy automation direction. Even though we don't know it with data for generative AI, for the pre-generative AI, artificial intelligence work that I did with Pasquale Restrepo, Joe Hazel, and David Otter shows that, in fact, AI was predominantly used for automation. And one way you can see that is the establishments that have a lot of automatable tasks. That's the green, and followed by the blue, sort of the next 25% of automatable tasks that have invested in AI. And unfortunately, this does not appear to have led to a big productivity revolution either. So how could you do better AI? Again, history is actually quite useful, because when you look at history, you see that periods in which productivity increased, worker wages increased, were also related to technology, but they were very fundamentally related to a different use of technology. In particular, the way that you help the workers by creating new, more complex tasks, giving them machinery so that they can do more things, is fundamentally different than automation, which sidelines humans. And for example, you have a great illustration of that, for example, from Henry Ford's car factories, which were at the forefront of automation by introducing new machinery, interchangeable parts system, later assembly lines, but at the same time also introduce a whole slew of new tasks for manual workers and office workers, and a whole training regiment, and early 20th centuries example of symbiosis between human skills and machinery. And you can have many examples of those today, which make workers quite central. So why is it that we're not taking this better AI path? There are political economy reasons for that, related to who controls AI when it's a very oligarchic structure like currently with Google, Facebook, Microsoft. It's much less likely to do so, but also it's very much related to this Turing vision that I articulated. If your view is that AI is a major step towards artificial general intelligence and it's going to create autonomous machine intelligence, it is part of the package that you should use it to do tasks because it's going to be better than human tasks. And in fact, if you look at the AI industry, one of the best metrics for individual success is if an engineer achieves human parity, or its engineer writes a model or a program that achieves human parity. So the whole sort of approach of the industry is focused on automation rather than this, what I've called the better AI or the new task creation. This is not the only problem. I think it's the most important one in my mind because that's what my work has focused on for the largest part. And it's the most political economy one, together with the control of information I will come to. But there are also some other more subtle things that the industry has completely missed. And one of them is very important, which is the loss of informational diversity. This is a very subtle issue, but its subtlety sometimes obscures its importance. So if you think of getting better information, which people now believe they are doing from ChatGPT, you may or may not agree with it, but it's part of it is about correcting human mistakes. So, the right thing is for me to go right. And previously I was going left while Henrik was going right. And then I talk to ChatGPT, I get advice, and as a result, I can also go right. So that reduces diversity, but it's the bad kind of diversity. I was making a completely avoidable mistake. But imagine a situation in which I was going left because I have different preferences, or I actually want to discover information about how different things would be if I went left. So I'm experimenting, or I'm trying to find out something new. So if you provide too much incentives for everybody to follow recommendations of a large language model, you're going to reduce the valuable form of informational diversity. We already see that in some pre-AI technologies. For example, GPS, which is of course very useful, when introduced in driving systems, has raised the homogenization of the routes that people take, which has often actually, rather than helping, has increased congestions in urban areas. A couple of studies have shown. But it's actually worse than that, because the informational diversity is at the root of human knowledge. And it's the human knowledge that these ChatGPT systems or foundation models or large language models are using, expropriating, building on, whatever word you want to use. And they may actually be digging their own grave as well as the grave of human knowledge, because they're actually creating disincentives for that information to be created. For instance, I mentioned the the GPT-4 based GitHub Copilot, which programs simple routines in Java or Python or programs like that. How did that do that? How did GPT-4 learn to program? It certainly wasn't some sort of logic rule-based learning that enabled it to do so. Instead, it actually built on human expertise. And the way that it did that is very interesting. For a long time, there has been a wonderful website called Stack Overflow, where you can post questions related to math and related to programming, and then other experts try to help you. So it's actually an excellent example of self-organized cooperation among humans for information sharing. It's actually a very nicely done website. So the answers are nicely curated. Other people comment on them, or they upvote, downvote. So it's like an ideal place to train an AI system, and that's exactly what they have done. But then what happens when GPT-4 is released in 2023? What you see is that after GPT-4 is released, there is a complete drop in the activity in Stack Overflow computer science. And the reason for that is because people are no longer going and communicating with other humans, but they are actually instead asking those questions in private to GPT-4. And you can see that it's actually related to GPT-4 because it doesn't happen in Math Overflow, that's this black line, and it also doesn't happen in Russian language computer science and Chinese computer science. Why not? because in those countries GPT-4 was banned. So if you were a Russian needing some programming advice, you still left a message on the Stack Overflow. So or the equivalent in the Chinese one, which is segmentfold. So it's very much related to the AI systems destroying the type of information that they are taking away, or they're building on from human expertise. So it's not only that AI systems will sideline humans in the production process with my concern of excessive automation, but they will actually discourage the right type of communication between humans. The other problem that I think is very subtle and imperfectly understood is AI-human misalignment. Now, some of you may have read books like Alignment Problem, which talk about what happens when there is a super intelligent computer. I have no interest in that. I think it's complete science fiction and of no relevance. But there is a much deeper alignment problem. If, in fact, the way that you want to use generative AI tools as a way of providing advice, information, better tools for humans, then humans need to understand where that advice or where that information is coming from. So imagine, for example, you're a doctor. You already have a lot of information, accumulated expertise from years. You've looked at the case file, you've looked at the radiology output, you've spoken to a doctor, to a patient, and now you have to do a diagnosis. But then I introduce an AI system and I give you an advice and I say, this person probably has cancer. Now, at that point, you don't know where that AI system's recommendation is coming from. It's a complete black box. Even the best programmers, even those who have worked on foundation models themselves, have no idea where that recommendation is coming from. It's part of the bad way in which I think these generative AI models were designed, that they have no explainability, no transparency. So at that point, what can you do as a doctor? Well, either you can completely ignore that advice, in which case we have gotten no benefit from these $1 trillion big investment. You can foolishly follow it, in which case we have fully automated doctors, which is not, I think, most people want. Or you can make your guess as to what the basis of that recommendation is and how you should actually combine it with your own expertise. And this is a beautiful paper by my colleagues, Nikhil Agrawal, Tobias Solz, that actually really looks at a real world example of this with physicians. And what they find is that there's a complete misalignment. Physicians don't understand what recommendations the AI systems give. They put information or excessive information they put excessive emphasis on the information they themselves have, actually make systematic mistakes because of this misalignment about their cognitive understanding and the AI system's design of what sort of information it is providing. The final thing I want to mention, and then I'll conclude, is control of information. Throughout history, control of information has been critical. You cannot have a political regime, without some amount of control of information, because people have to be convinced to look at the world from your eyes and accept your own interpretation of events or your own authority or your own conflict resolution aspects. And throughout history, who controls information has been one of the most charged parts of political economy. Part of the reason why the panopticon that Jeremy Bentham introduced in 1791, which is which is in part of our current culture because of Michel Foucault's writing or movies like The Guardians of the Galaxy, is so important because it was a tool of information control. Bosses or school principals controlling the information in a one-dimensional way. Now, the issue is that the large language models are very much in the direction of monopolized control of information. Information is collected in these systems, and a small group of people decide how to use it. For example, it's not that these models are completely self-taught. There is a first unsupervised learning stage of foundation models, but then a very significant part of the spending is in the reinforcement learning part, where the models are taught to say, this is fake, this is not, this is doable, this is not doable, this you can say, this you cannot say. So somebody is essentially completely controlling the information. So that's compared to the sort of the ideal of, for example, you have a media ecosystem where different ideas can flourish and compete, is the complete opposite, is a high level of centralization. Now, that centralization may have some benefits as well as costs, but its costs become much more dominant when they are used for surveillance and manipulation. And in fact, the evidence that we have from the industry is that precisely because of the business models of the industry and the vision of the industry leaders is being increasingly used for manipulation. And one of the most manipulative parts would be when the Chinese Communist Party uses it. But actually, I think the extent of manipulation is no less, perhaps even more, when large platforms use them in order for digital ads, because for the digital ads to be most useful, you need to be able to manipulate people's perception in the highest possible way. Now, this is again a political economy problem. It's about regulation, but it also has first order implication for our politics and for our economy. Because when there is such a high degree of centralization of information and manipulation, then it becomes impossible to have democratic foundations. And in fact, the issue in the short run may be misinformation and disinformation, but I am much more worried about the medium run, which is what the scholar of totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt, foresaw, 4 decades ago, when she said, if everybody lies to you, the consequence is not that you believe the lies, but rather that nobody believes anything any longer. But if nobody believes anything any longer, then the shared understanding that is so critical for democracy, for human agency, completely evaporate. So if this is the case, what can we do? I think the good news is that it's possible to do generative AI better. The bad news is that we are going in exactly the opposite direction. And I don't think there is any self-acting, self-correcting mechanism here. In fact, if you look at where AI research is coming from, a very small part of it comes from governments and academia. The more than 80% of it is either directly controlled by the industry or industry academic collaboration. And even what gets qualified as academic is actually very heavily influenced by the industry. So the visions that I mentioned at the beginning, artificial general intelligence, autonomous machine intelligence, machines controlling humans, which typically means elites controlling machines that then control humans, I think is the direction we are heading in. So Simon Johnson and I in our book, and myself in some of my writing, then suggest some concrete steps for redesigning AI, which is about changes in the industry, changes in the incentives. And since time is short, let me go extremely quickly and mention them rather than going into detail. I think critically, we need to reduce the focus on automation. I think unless you move away from this excessive automation focus and excessive focus on autonomous machine intelligence, we're not going to avoid the disastrous path that we are on. That requires some institutional changes, some policy changes. For example, tax policy. Today, we in the OECD, especially in the US, but other countries in Europe as well, we create a tremendously powerful set of incentives that favor machines ahead of workers. Some of it comes from the desire of managers to control workers, some of it comes from international competition, but an important part of it comes from tax policy. We subsidize when firms use automated machinery, and we tax them when they hire labor. So I think tax policy so that capital and labor are treated more symmetrically is going to be very important. The fact that platforms can use data without making payments for it, I think, is creating a slippery slope for both a very unequal and concentrated development of the industry, but also it's going to exacerbate these trends that I mentioned in the middle when I mentioned AI digging its own grave. And that's actually very important, because without high quality data, you cannot have the AI human complementarity that I am favoring. So the more you make it difficult to have high quality data out there, the more you are tipping the balance in favor of the current architecture of AI. I think the way that AI models are monetized right now is completely distorted. Most of it is through digital ad taxes, which create very manipulative incentives, and they kill alternative business models, they kill competition. And then I think these are very easy things to fix by digital ad taxes that OECD and the US can pass. And also, I think we need a strong regime of government subsidies to different visions of AI models, human complementary AI. We need new norms and regulations. And also, I think even we need to rethink what the right architecture of generative AI models need to be. I think we have taken it completely for granted that we're going to be mesmerized and impressed by ChatGPT and Gemini because they can write Shakespearean sonnets. If you actually go a step back and you say, well, what do we want from these AI models? We certainly don't want them to write Shakespearean sonnets. So if we don't want them to write Shakespearean sonnets, why are we spending billions of dollars so that they have those capabilities rather than the more reliable information that would be complementary to humans? So I think all of those require us much more thinking, and the civil society and government regulation to be much more heavily involved in the democratic control of this very transformative technology. Thank you very much. I'll stop here and I'll take some questions.
Sorry? Okay. Thank you, Daron. This was excellent. And with your last slide, you kind of preempted the one question I was going to ask you, which is which are the most realistic policy levers you see for getting the development of AI to be more in line with this non-Turing kind of Engelbart-style vision of complementing human capabilities and judgment? Is it taxing externalities? Is it subsidizing alternatives? Is it new legal rights? What do you think would be the most important ones to pursue?
I don't think any one of them is a silver bullet. But if I thought which one would be the easiest one to pass and quite effective, I think digital ad taxes could be very easy to pass. They would get, of course, a lot of opposition from the industry, but they're very easy to implement, and I think there could be broader support for them. Capital labor tax equalization, I think, is also easy to implement. I don't think it's going to be very effective. It's going to have some effect, but the excessive automation is not just coming from the tax code. The tax code is pretty distorted. In the US, it's not as bad in Sweden, but in the US, the marginal tax rate you pay if you hire a worker jointly with the worker is about 30%. The marginal tax rate you pay if you hire an automated system is close to zero. So it's a big wedge, but I don't think that's going to be transformative in and of itself. I think data markets are very important, but they're very difficult to build. So some of them will take time.
Yeah. We're going to open up for questions, but I'm going to ask one first, because historically, as you know, not least here in Sweden, we've had a system of wanting more automation to increase productivity by actually encouraging higher labor costs, right? This was a core part of the Swedish model, so to speak. So what would you say have changed, and what's the situation that makes you...
Well, I think I am not against automation. And in fact, I should have emphasized this more.
Oh, no,
automation has been with us throughout, and it will continue to be. And it's a very important part of reducing costs. So I think what I am favoring and what I'm hoping is to achieve a balanced system where there is automation, but at the same time you have new skilled work emerging. And the evidence, at least the way that I read it, is that there are many problems in the Nordic countries, there are many problems in Switzerland and Germany, but these countries, through some labor regulations, but especially collective bargaining, have done better in that together with automation, new tasks have been introduced. Workers have been, rather than being fired, have been promoted with more skills and training. Right. So I think I would interpret the Nordic model as via, not through planning, but via the corporatist model, avoid some of the worst excessive automation biases. So, for example, work by one of my students, Jonas Takuri, shows that in Finland, when companies were subsidized for advanced machinery, they introduced those advanced machinery, but at the same time, while automating work, they also increased their labor demand. Now, another aspect, which of course is in favor of Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, and not very different from the US, is that these are small open economies. So they're exporting a lot of their output. So that, of course, creates somewhat of an easier dynamic in dealing with these issues.
Yeah. So a more constructive relationship between labor and capital is what you're asking for. Okay.
Absolutely.
So I think we had a question towards the back here.
Okay, so thank you for a great talk, very enlightening. I'm Eric Sterner, and I'm working on the pedagogics of sustainable development, broadly speaking. And one of the things that I do is that I try to empower teachers and educators to use AI for better learning in this area. So I'm wondering how we can, from your perspective, approach AI in education and trainings, given the perspective of wanting to rather empower humans to be able to learn and do more, take the better AI path.
Thank you very much, Eric. That's a great question. And in fact, in the book and in some of my other writing, I discuss education a lot because I think it's a perfect illustration of the possibilities and the tensions. So here is the way that I would describe this. And of course, you have more information about education, so you may disagree with some of my high-level interpretation. But I see two paths in education right now. One path is we're going to use more and more automated systems, and some of that is going to take the form of automated exam, automated grading, MOOC type things where the teaching is going to be done online while teachers may be on the side. And we're also going to do a different type of automation, which is that rather than expecting students to learn by interacting with other fellow students or their teachers, we're going to expect them to learn from accessing, say, ChatGPT or the next version of the large language model. Call that path number one. Path number two is a very different possibility, where we use AI systems to complement teachers, in particular, identify what sorts of problems different students are having. So create a version of personalized education that's much more technology-based. That would require schools to hire more teachers, because personalized education, even if it's not one-on-one, is going to need more teachers. The teachers to be much better trained in prompting, understanding, using AI systems, a new set of guidelines so that student data is not monetized when it's being used in the context of understanding their specific difficulties and developing more personalized curricula. And so it's a whole different ecosystem. So I would say path one is very pernicious for learning, and it will have long-term negative effects, whereas path two, I think, is very promising. And which one do you think we are more likely to head right now? So right now, there are one or two companies or labs that are thinking about things that I've just described in path two, and there is hundreds of millions of dollars going into path one. So my concern is that, again, while there is great room in education for better AI, that's not where the industry is pushing us towards.
Okay, great, thanks. We have a question here in the middle.
Thank you. Very interesting talk. My name is Daron Acemoglu, and I'm an economist working, for example, on optimal taxation stuff. So I found your reasoning about taxing of automation and capital interesting, but I have two concerns which I would like to hear your reflections on. And one is the measurability issue, in the sense that there are different types of capital, obviously, and some types of capital are not at all bad. I mean, for example, there could be a nice worker environment at firms, and you don't want to tax that, or you want to tax some kind of capital. Wouldn't it be a problem of measuring it, because it would be a huge incentive for firms to relabel capital, sort of real automation would be called something else, and it may even be hard to disentangle which kind of capital is what, and then they could, the same kind of investment can have different purposes and so forth. That's one issue. And another related issue to some extent is the fact that it's related to the coordination issue among different countries. And suppose one government, of course, there is a risk of being raised to the bottom in that type of legislation, right? Because for a certain government, it might be, they would consider it bad to tax their own automation. They would think they would have relative advantages compared to other countries. So it will be hard to obtain the kind of coordination needed for that. So these are my two remarks. So we're looking forward to your responses.
Yeah. I think those are very good remarks, and I completely agree that it would be a hopeless task to try to decide for the tax authorities what is automation capital, what is not, and that's definitely not what I am suggesting. In fact, I'm not in favor of robot taxes and things like that, because I think it's exactly what you say. You may be able to identify robots, but you're not going to be able to identify automation machinery or new tasks. So that's why my suggestion is much more limited, more blunt, but just get rid of the distortions that exist in the tax system that encourage all kinds of capital excessively relative to labor. But you don't want to do that just by increasing taxes on capital. So you want to do a more fundamental tax reform. At the same time, for example, reduce payroll taxes so that it does not have a negative effect on economic activity. I think the place where you can try to identify some human complementary equipment and support it would be in the research process. And that's why I suggested new government subsidies. For example, in the US, there could be a new government agency that tries to deal with these AI issues. And I think the reason why that's a better system is, as I said in response to Henrik's first question, I am definitely not against automation. I wouldn't want to slow down automation, provided that it is associated with other things for humans, that it does not erode human agency, it does not create a massive force towards greater inequality or less central work for workers. So as long as we can create an ecosystem in which that's the case, I think it's fine for automation to go on. And I think we need automation because, if you look at the bright side, some of the tasks that have been automated over the last 100 years were some very dangerous tasks. They were physically very demanding that led to high levels of injuries. So I think those are the tasks that we want to automate. But the worst thing would be you automate the human task and you don't do anything in its place.
Okay, great. One more question I think we have time for in the back.
Hi, yeah, Martin Iverson. Thank you for a very interesting speech. I was thinking about the two systems that you showed from Turing and Wiener. Typically, if you look at the leverage points from Donella Meadows, the systems thinker, the late systems thinker that I'm sure you're familiar with, is that correct? Mm-hmm. They are looking at this with two very different mindsets or mental models, or even seeing this as very different reasons why we do all we do as a life together in the first place. Yet a lot of the interventions you mentioned are way lower intervention points or leverage points. Do you have any comment to that?
That's an excellent question, and 100% agreed. I think it's a mindset, but you can't control a mindset. So I think the way that you change a mindset is not via social engineering, but by creating a different institutional environment. So it's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to, but I can have conjectures. But why is it that we don't have people like Engelbart and JCR Licklider today? And part of the reason is because we've created an institutional environment in which tech leaders are completely unmoored from society. They're not subject to society. We gave them license to do anything they want. We have even told them you can engage in as much disruption as you want. We're going to subsidize it rather than sort of worry about its social consequences. We also created the largest corporations that humanity has ever witnessed and gave them financial incentives for automation. And we have also created a monolithic mindset among computer scientists. So all of these, in a systemic way, have led to this computers ahead of humans perspective. How do you change that? You start chipping at it. So you create a more competitive environment. You create financial incentives where the alternative, more human complementary machines can be more profitable as well. And you create a debate around these issues rather than sort of accepting the Turing sort of perspective, hook, line, and sinker, which is, again, completely common in the tech industry. You start having this discussion. But yes, I don't think there is an easier way of changing the mindset.
So one more question I think we'll squeeze in, and then perhaps I will ask one if I have time, because I have one more that I want to ask. So Rabbi, please.
Thank you for your insightful comments and presentation. So I'm interested in the application of generative AI integration into the healthcare sector. And now there's a split in the views. Some are favoring the proprietary closed LLMs or a large language multimodal, while the other are more into the open source. So my question is there any way in between for both, and how we can achieve a better AI in healthcare rapidly? Is there any shortcut there?
Great question, and I think healthcare is the another one of the major applications together with education. I think there are very different ways of doing healthcare. I actually don't think open source versus proprietary models is going to be the big difference. For example, how you integrate nurses is going to be one of the big issues. So now nurses are right now exist in an environment where they don't get much support in terms of information or ability to create new tasks, and I think that's going to be a key issue. There are other questions related to open source about control, about privacy, and so on. My read of the of the industry is that right now we are going towards a middle path, as you suggested, which is that open source elements are being integrated, but we're not going to go to a full open source system because of regulations and because also of the domination of a few players, which is not going to favor the open source. But probably some open source elements are here to stay. Now, how that interplays with the data privacy issues in healthcare, I don't know. That's a good issue to worry about.
Okay. So now I'll ask my question. You referred before to the alignment problem not being the one that we hear so much about with existential risk and artificial general intelligence, etc. So I wanted to ask you what your take is on Sam Altman, Mark Zuckerberg and others testifying before Congress and making claims that we should put a moratorium on, for instance, developing powerful LLMs or harvesting data, as in the case of Zuckerberg. Is that just a pure case of attempts at regulatory capture and influencing legislation? And what's your take on those people's alignment with the existential risk crowd? Do you think it's just a matter of a common enemy?
I think that's a very good question, and one that would take an hour to answer in full. But let me give you two elements. I think, sure, of course, when Sam Altman says the industry should be regulated, his hope is that the industry is regulated in a way consistent with his financial incentives. But many of these people are truly believing in existential risk. And why are they truly believing in existential risk? They believe in existential risk because existential risk aligns very well with the way that they got into this industry, which is to think that this is an amazing technology and they're shepherding this technology towards such fast advances that it's going to turn into artificial general intelligence. So I think that is a belief. It is a self-serving belief, but at a higher level self-serving belief than I want my company not to be regulated and other companies to be regulated. So there's a little bit of that, but then we also live in a society where for the last 60 years we've been exposed to some wonderful and not so wonderful movies and science fiction writing, which says super intelligent machines are coming. Again, Engelbart's vision of a better mouse doesn't make a good Hollywood movie, and a killer robot does. So we are being influenced by that media system.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Daron, and a big round of applause.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It was a pleasure to be able to speak to you, all of you.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, then I think we'll hand over a virtual gift that is being made in your name to the UNICEF. Let me see exactly what the name of it was. The UNICEF School in a Box program.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks very much. I am honored.
Yeah, so thanks again for your gift to the School in a Box program.
Thank you very much.
Okay, then we switch to the next speaker.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I just happened to see Jean-Luc Godard's AlphaFold in the film festival from 1965, talking about Alpha 60 controlling AlphaFold. So it's time to go to our last speaker for today, which is a great pleasure and privilege for me to introduce. It's Professor Shalom Lappin, who's had a distinguished career in both industry with IBM and in many other academic positions. He's currently Professor of Natural Language Processing at Queen Mary University in London. Before that, he was the founding director of the VR Center of Excellence called CLASP, which is Center for Applied Linguistic Theory and Applied Probability here in Gothenburg, and with which he is now associated as senior research scientist. So great pleasure again, and on a personal note, had great interaction with Shalom throughout these years, and we actually wrote a piece in The Guardian on some of the topics, the themes that we've been discussing today. So over to you, Shalom.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this interesting and important event. My talk will make contact with the previous two talks on a number of important issues, but whereas they were looking outward from inward from looking at AI and computer science more generally from the perspective of law, the first talk, Hannah's, and economics and social political issues from Daron's perspective, I'm looking from the opposite perspective as someone who's actually involved in AI and computer science and trying to understand why some of the problematic social and political effects of the models that are being discussed have come about, and to try and explain, or at least suggest explanations that are related to the design of these systems. So it's an internalist perspective. What I want to start talking about, first of all, is the transformers, which are the deep learning systems, the deep neural network learning systems that power large language models. And they're not all generative, actually, and they're not all one size, but they do have certain features in common. Then I want to look at the rapid expansion of these models in terms of various dimensions of size, and then talk about the problem of the opacity, which was discussed in the previous talk, the fact that it's not clear exactly how they operate in terms of the kinds of learning that they do, and then draw some conclusions concerning possible alternatives to these models and how that should guide future research. So large language models have revolutionized AI, and as we know, this is virtually trivial, but has been remarked on in not only the previous two talks, but everyone else discussing AI, has generated very rapid progress in a variety of domains. It's often hard to appreciate if you've grown up in the last 20 years, as say my children have, how radically the situation in AI has changed. So when I was at IBM in the late 80s, early 90s, they actually were in the process of closing down the AI department because they felt it didn't contribute to the business model that IBM was pursuing. It was a hardware company, and the kind of software they were interested in would be in support of its hardware concerns. And this is why I ended up going to England in '93 to take up a position at the university to return to academic life. And it's difficult to understand the extent to which AI was an endangered species in computer science throughout much of its history for the past 50 years. And it's only in the last 20 years that it became talk of the town, and in the past 10 years that it began to become a very big business. Until then, it was very much the stepchild of computer science, and many computer science departments looked upon it as not a fully legitimate area of research. My view of the history of AI, many of the ideas that I'm discussing are coming out of a book I'm in the process of writing at the insistence of my children, who said, "Dad, we haven't understood what you've been doing all these years. You owe it to us to finally explain it." So this book is for them. The history of AI is actually not the history of automation. I sort of disagree with the previous speaker on this point, not on others. It's actually the history of an attempt to understand human cognition through models which were computationally viable. And the recent success of AI was almost an accident of hardware rather than of software. The software ideas which are driving AI are very old. They go back to the 40s and 50s, the perceptrons, etc. Anybody who's older than 40, if there are any of you, will know that these ideas have been around for a very, very long time. It's in fact the emergence of GPUs due to the intense demands of gaming through a younger generation which wanted fast graphics that produced the kind of hardware we could run the software that had been around for so long, but which we had been running on spare television parts, and only recently now can be properly trained. So the areas now that AI is managed to make progress in were exactly the areas where they were told, and we were told, we would never succeed, which was machine translation. AI was almost closed down in the 60s by a report called the ALPAC report, which said, forget about automatic translation. It's never going to work. At best, you'll get assisted translation. If they could see what's going on with neural machine translation now, they think differently. Natural language generation, which was always a sticking point in traditional AI because it was so awkward and clunky. Question answering, which never worked very well, is now doing remarkably well. Image description, pattern recognition. These are areas which have exploded in the last 5 to 10 years. Language models are not in themselves actually objects, formal objects of computer science. They're driven by something called transformers. And transformers consist of layers of attention heads. I'm going to get into some very mildly technical discussion. If this causes some discomfort, forgive me. But I think it's important to have at least a broad sense of how these systems work if we're going to make claims about them. Actually, the transformers were created in 2015 in a seminal paper by Badenauer and et al. In Google. This was Google Mind. And they introduced something called attention to an encoder-decoder system. So Badenauer didn't actually create transformers. He created something called attention. And attention is a system that preserves information from previous hidden encoder states in a deep neural network. What it does is it gives you a fine-grained procedure for assigning weights to the elements of an input, words, pixels, etc., of a context vector that the encoder creates and passes to a decoder in a deep neural network system. So basically, you can think of attention as a system for scanning and recognizing different parts of an input and aligning the output of an encoder with the output of a decoder, so that if you think of this as a translation problem, most problems can be formulated as varieties of translation problems in AI, that it will increase the accuracy of the alignment between the encoded and decoded vectors of a sequence-to-sequence network. I'll give you a diagrammatic indication of how that works in a machine translation context. So the attention is going to allow the network to learn the relative significance of each element of the input string, which wasn't possible in earlier networks. And the attention layers were originally incorporated into earlier forms of deep neural networks, what are called recurrent neural networks, or RNNs, and convolutional neural networks. So here's an attention heat map. On the left side of this matrix, you see a French sentence, and on the right side, it's English translation. And the different, along the diagonal line, the different squares, the darker the square, the greater the degree of attention that the system, which is a neural translation system, it's a neural network doing machine translation, assigns to those items. And therefore, the alignment is going to be more focused on those items. Now, in 2017, Vaswani and company actually constructed a system consisting entirely of attentional heads. These were non-recurrent systems. This is when the transformer was born. So it's actually fairly recent. It's a grand total of 6 or 7 years old. And this is a diagram of how it works. And rather than go through the details, what you'll see is that, in fact, in a transformer, what you have are only multi-headed attention units at each layer, which then attach to a feed-forward system in the network that achieves a certain normalization through weights, and then feeds it to the next for the next part of the input to another layer of attention. And then at the end, you get what's called softmax, or an alternative to it, which gives you a probability distribution. Depending on the task that you're performing, the probability distribution will ascend probabilities of the entire string, the output string, having certain properties. Deep neural networks now are trained on large amounts of text and other sorts of data. And they're trained in such a way that what they extract is word embeddings not simple statistics, but word embeddings. So an embedding, and this is for large language models, this gets generalized to other kinds of data too. So an embedding is a vector consisting of real numbers, and each element of the vector corresponds to a distributional feature of the word. That is, its combinatorial properties, which words, other words it can combine with. And it needn't be a word, it can be another kind of data point too, like pixel. The embeddings are really encoding all the combinatorial co-occurrence patterns of the item in a large training corpus. And the large number of dimensions of the embeddings have to be compressed in order to efficiently compute an output. So basically what you're doing is you're compressing the whole distributional history of the elements of the string. So there's a lot of information in these vectors. And distributional features of the embedding is going to give you what are called the parameters of the model. Geez, by this point I thought or hoped I'd lose most of the audience, but it seems I've got computer scientists around. Okay, the features that are used to compute that are used and compressed and retained in the vectors are used to compute to represent abstract semantic relations among words and other data points. In other words, what they're giving us a kind of topography or a conceptual map of the data. And that's what the pre-training gives us. So it's more abstract than just combinatorial patterns. Mathematical transformations are applied to give us a kind of ontology or a topography of where these items fit in and how they can combine. Now, when you move to multimodal embeddings, which most large language models are now, particularly like ChatGPT 4, but also many others, the embeddings capture correlations not only of words, but also words with images, words with sounds, words with touch, haptic phenomena. So there's really huge amounts of data here. You get, if you will, a kind of distributional reconstruction of a perceptual world with language. Now, autoregressive transformers, this is the part of the transformer world which is in fact generative. Processes input from left to right. So it's going to predict the next token on the basis of preceding sequence. This is kind of a fairly simple idea. And what these kinds of transformers will produce, like other linear or sequential deep neural networks before them, is a probability distribution over items in the vocabulary. So they'll know which item has the highest property as a possible candidate for continuing a string. In this way, and they will finish computing a sequence S. And of course, I see that the translation into PowerPoint from my native LaTeX Beamer has introduced a Y and wrecked up an equation. But okay, this is just a standard probability equation. That should be sum of. So the probability of a string is going to be the sum of the conditional probabilities of all of its items given the sequences which precede them, with the very unhelpful distortions represented by PowerPoint. But of course, people who depend on Microsoft for accuracy have their own problems. We won't go there. OpenAI is ChatGPT's OpenAI's ChatGPT 1 to 4. Are examples, prime examples of generative autoregressive transformers of this kind, although they use the right equation, I should point out. They're not into, even though they're Microsoft owned, they don't distort the equation. Okay, now they're not the only kind of transformers. There are other kinds. So you have what are called mass context transformers, and these are not that widely known outside the AI community, but they're actually very influential for all sorts of tasks of image recognition, text understanding, question answering, etc. They're trained by masking tokens in an input sequence, very much like a cloze test when you try and predict a word in a given context on the left and right with a blank there. And the model learns to predict from left to right through exposure to large amounts of data, and you get embeddings built that way. And these transformers are non-sequential. They don't go left to right or right to left. They go in both directions. And they don't give you real probability distributions. They give you quasi-probability or pseudo-probability distributions. the prime example is BERT, which was created again from Google in 2019, and there are all sorts of variants, and they're very powerful systems that actually perform much better than autoregressive systems for certain kinds of recognition and interpretation tasks. This is an example of how BERT is trained. It's from Rani Chorev in 2018, and you'll see at the bottom between W3 and W5 a mask element which is fed to a transformer encoder, and then the prediction is of O4, which gets you a word. When you fine-tune a transformer of either kind, an autoregressive versus another versus contextual, doesn't matter. What you're doing is you're adding new dedicated layers of attention heads, or you're retraining some of the pre-trained layers. So when you're given a transformer, it's already been pre-trained on vast amounts of data, so it has all of this information of the kind that I described in the previous slide. But if you want to get it up and running for a particular task in a way that's accurate and specifically appropriate for that task, you fine-tune it, which means you train it on smaller amounts of data. And the data sets from a specific domain then are used for this kind of training or retraining of particular layers, which then come to contain or encode that additional information. So it's on top of the pre-trained layer rather than in place of it. And it's basically a procedure for customizing the model to a particular task or set of applications. Now, the size of a transformer model, and this across different sorts of models, I think you can say roughly that it depends on three main factors, at least. There are others also. But first, the number of layers and attention heads in the model, right? The more there are, the larger the model is going to be. But also the number of parameters in the model, where this is basically the parameters are the features that are identified in the embeddings, and then the size of the data on which it's trained. So most of the exponential explosion in size of transformers that drive large language models has been in 2 and 3. That is both the parameter size and in the size of the data. Adding additional layers can help, but it's a very small linear addition. So let's get a sense of how quickly that the other two kinds of expansion have taken us. So OpenAI's ChatGPT 2, which came out in 2019, which seems like prehistory now, it was trained on it was trained with 1.5 billion parameters, which was considered enormous at the time. By the time we got to ChatGPT 3, which was only 3.5 years ago, it was 175 billion. And now, of course, OpenAI doesn't tell you the details of training, parameter size, and cost, but estimates in the technical literature put the number of parameters for ChatGPT 4 at 1.76 trillion parameters. So if I were to graph this, which I generally don't do, but if we were to graph it, you'd see a very sharp hyper-exponential increase. Similarly with training data, so ChatGPT 3 was trained on 300 billion tokens, and that's from their paper, from their actual technical description when they still gave out the details and the code of the system. Whereas ChatGPT 4, which is multimodal, meaning its embeddings include at least visual as well as linguistic data, word and image embeddings, was pre-trained on a huge amount of data which far exceeds ChatGPT 3 because of the fact that it's multimodal. So we just don't know exactly what its extent is, but we can imagine. Let's look at the cost. So the cost of training ChatGPT 3 on a GPU, that's a graphic processing unit cluster, is estimated at $4 million US dollars. That's from an article in something called Lambda. And Sam Altman of OpenAI is quoted as saying that the cost of training ChatGPT 4 was $100 million. So you see a huge increase in cost of training, which correlates, of course, with the amount of data and the amount of time that the system has to run. Now, this is creating rather serious resource and environmental issues because the amount of energy required to power the machines in training is just astronomical. Narayan et al. in NVIDIA Developer, which is a technical blog for NVIDIA, which is the chip company that produces GPUs, observes that ChatGPT-3 can be trained on 1024 A100 GPUs. If you don't know what it is, ask the people here to show you a GPU of that size, because they have them here at Chalmers. Whereas Minda from Rice blog, he's homegrown. That Rice is a Swedish AI agency, and Minda is, I gather from the name, Swedish. So in October of this past year, he estimates that ChatGPT-4 required 25,000 NVIDIA units of that size. So it's a factor of 25,000 increase to go from ChatGPT-3 to ChatGPT-4 for training. Now, how much energy does that involve? Well, Saul and Bass in a Bloomberg account article claimed that ChatGPT-3 consumed 1.287 gigawatt hours of electricity. That's the equivalent of what 120 American households use. American households are not known for being particularly conservative in their use of electricity, maybe in political matters, but not in electricity usage. Minda suggests that training ChatGPT-4 consumed 50 gigawatt hours, so that would be a small town. So training one large language model requires the energy used to power a small American town. So clearly the rapid expansion of computational resources required for training and developing large language models are going to have, has already had, rather serious environmental implications. This is only for mainstream AI use. If you consider other kinds of uses like cryptocurrency and blockchains, the Chinese have actually closed down their blockchaining, as have other countries, because they were basically competing with whole cities for electricity. So these are very serious issues, which are not discussed as such, but they are. Now, only large tech companies like OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, Meta have the resources to develop, train, and support LLM. So this was pointed out. Hannah pointed this out. Darren pointed this out. Now you know why. Okay, from the design feature, it's not something that they're doing maliciously. It's something that they have no choice, given the architecture of the system. And this is, by the way, it's interesting that Hannah included this very same point. I discovered this only last week in the context of researching a chapter in a book. The Stanford University Artificial Intelligence Index report, which you quoted, observes that in 2014, the focus of AI had shifted drastically from universities to tech companies. So in the past, virtually all major machine learning work was done at universities and small, independent, publicly supported agencies or startups. Whereas in 2022, 32 significant machine learning models came out of the tech companies and 3 out of the academic institutions. So that gives you a sense of the skewed nature of research that has been brought about by the size of these models and what's required to train them. And the reason they're effective is because of pre-training to give you these kinds of word embeddings, particularly the multimodal case. So as a result of the trend, tech companies are effectively exercising control, which I would call monopoly control, over research in deep learning. And researchers at universities and small research agencies and startups have become basically clients. Those of us who have students know that basically they're working like Lego assemblers with prefab Python libraries, putting together parts of models and then fine-tuning them where the models come from the tech companies. So while tech companies have been responsible for important progress, their current position has basically skewed research towards commercial interests. And important scientific issues are being ignored. There are non-solutions to this problem. One is using reinforcement learning, which basically speeds up learning and allows learning to be task general, but it's not going to solve the problem because you still need the full pre-trained model to do it. There's another possible solution called knowledge distillation, where you have a large pre-trained model and then you use it. I see all the diacritics from Czech have also been displaced by Microsoft. Anyway, yes, I won't go into my views on Microsoft. when you use knowledge distillation, you save the client company a great deal of money by allowing it to build a small, compact version of a full model because you restrict the probability distribution on which it's trained to the desired one, but you still need the big model to train, so you haven't saved anything. Most deep neural networks are opaque. We don't know why they precisely achieve the kind of success in recognizing recalcitrant inductive generalization patterns. And one of the reasons for that is that the functions, the activation functions, which determine when information is forwarded and how much from different layers and units in a network to others, these are all nonlinear functions. And therefore they're not reversible, and we don't have compositionality in the vectors which are produced. It's possible to use a variety of techniques to try and get insight, and these involve techniques like probing or ablation, which means deactivating attention heads. But these are very indirect ways of rendering systems explainable. They're not, in fact, explainable. There are alternatives. So Jean-Philippe Bernardi is my colleague. He was originally at GU, but he's now here. I don't know if he's in the audience. This is largely his work. I was along as a kind of junior assistant. Proposed a unitary evolutionary recurrent neural network, which involves only linear functions and on orthogonal matrices to compute vectors. And very beautiful mathematically. It has only one small problem. It doesn't really work. Which is not his fault. It works for Dyke languages, which are bracket or parentheses languages, but it won't generalize to natural languages. And that's due to a combinatorial explosion in the number of columns and rows in the matrix. And the only way to control it is either by reintroducing nonlinear functions and losing transparency, or truncating the matrix, in which case you lose the information and hence the accuracy. So that's a research problem for the future. Let me just finish really quickly with some conclusions. So the development of large language models, which is really the history of the development of transformers that power them, have in fact created impressive progress across a variety of areas. These are not stochastic parents. They do really interesting things. Not quite what some people claim. They don't give you general intelligence. There is no such thing anyway. And that's, by the way, Turing knew that and said it. I will defend Turing against some of the criticisms made against him, as well as some of the AI people later in the panel discussion. I think the history of AI needs to be told in a somewhat different way than it was in one of the talks. This progress has come at the cost of a huge expansion in resources required to produce these transformer models, which are really functioning in brute force fashion. And that's not only the size of the models, but it's also the way they're trained and the way they're operating. To resolve the problem, we need smaller, smarter, more transparent deep learning systems, and ones which also have some sort of genuine scientific engineering and cognitive interest. And that requires a different kind of investment, not shaped solely by commercial concerns, but by long-term scientific interests, because they will pay off economically too. One way of reducing the data sets required to train LLMs is to actually create much better and stronger learning algorithms for machine learning systems, where they recognize relevant patterns from smaller quantities of training input. And you say, how do you do that? Well, humans do it. So if we look at the way humans do it, maybe we'll... And that's, in fact, the way neural networks started. They were originally inspired by attempts to model certain aspects of the brain, even though they went far away from that, which is fine. We also need much greater transparency, because if we don't know how the devices work, we can't redesign them in ways which is efficient. And that involves preserving compositionality in the generation of vectors. And in order to achieve these smaller and more transparent, efficient learning models, we'll be able to distribute control over the field of AI and return it to a much, much broader cross-section of the scientific community, which I think will work to everyone's advantage, both in the private and in the public sector. So let me just stop there.
Thanks a lot, Shalom, for a great overview and getting the technical perspective. So open up for questions. If people are still thinking about it, I can throw you one. So some people, I mean, you mentioned that I think Hannah also he put up that slide showing that the focus of research has shifted massively to industry, and we think it's problematic. Maybe you want to expand on that. But is there? Some people argue that there's no other way to do it because, to achieve some of these great successes, you have people like OpenAI, which have great engineering teams of 700 people working on the project in a coherent group, all addressing this problem. Whereas in academia, where we are scattered groups of 4 or 5 people, we are simply not going to be capable of doing such large engineering tasks. And so maybe this is best done by these academics, by industry, in producing these great success stories for the general benefit of society.
Okay, that's a very good point. The answer actually I think was already implicit in the previous lecture, in Daron's comments, which is how do we fund research? So if the emphasis on funding research is in the private sector, if they are the ones who receive effective subsidies through a tax system, whereas universities are starved of cash, then of course that's the situation. It wasn't always like that. In the 50s and 60s, in the post-war era, there was a public-private partnership with a lot of the research being done at universities. And this was due to heavy government investment. No one knows that better than Sweden. But also even in the United States, I mean, it's hard to imagine this now when you look at the current, I was going to say right wing, that's the only description I can give of it, economic and political views, but actually it was virtually non-controversial between Republicans and Democrats that active and massive scientific subsidy was required for scientific research in the universities, and that's where it was going, and then that fed into industrial development. So it's not necessary to have research completely monopolized by private venture capitalists and investors who decided at their whim and the concerns of tech giants. This is a kind of recreation of the 1920s golden age when there was no. One of the reasons, of course, that there was so much public investment in science was the Cold War, the fear of being outpaced by the Russians. Well, one can also think of constructive competition or reasons for investing, which isn't to defeat a military enemy, but to build a better and more profitable economy that has social benefit. And I think that that's the case that has to be made. So there is another way. The question is how to persuade people that in the long term it's really and even in the shorter term, it's very much in their interests that without a proper investment in the public domain, they will not get the kinds of systems that will bring social benefit.
Well, any other questions? Fine.
Just a comment on what you just said. Like in particle physics and say astronomy, you have large corporations of scientists doing something for the public good.
Right, of course.
Yeah. Maybe they can show you a way of.
Absolutely. The cyclotron and the collider in SWEB is a very good example of that.
CERN.
In CERN, yes, I meant CERN. Yeah.
There's one at the back there.
Hello, thanks. It was a good talk. So I suppose large language models, through the interface of language, I mean, people use this phrase foundational model. You can map a given problem to the LLM somewhat fuzzily. And that's in some way explains, I guess, how useful they are in lots of different domains. Do you see any other types of these kind of foundational models that aren't a language model that might avoid some of the downsides that you
Well, I suggested one that unfortunately didn't work, but it was a small effort, and it was a return to a recurrent neural network it was essentially a quantum circuit implemented as a recurrent neural network. I mean, there are many alternatives that one can think of. One can think of entirely different kinds of learning algorithms, which, if run on the right kind of equipment, could possibly produce much better results. I think the task is to find out how to extract interesting generalizations out of smaller amounts of data. We're not the only ones. I'm not the only one who's saying this. We had a conference in class last summer, which was devoted to learning from small data. It was called LSD. We attracted an interesting crowd, as you can imagine from the title. Some people had slightly interesting ideas of what we were doing. But there are, in fact, even amongst people who are working in industry, in the tech industry, have recognized that the current situation is not sustainable. Sam Altman has said as much himself. Whether he means it or not is another question. But I think that as large language models hit the limit of sustainability, the attention will necessarily shift to smarter, cleverer systems of learning. Whether there'll be enough money invested to speed up development of those systems is very much an open question. One hopes yes.
I can pitch in and say that we have a local startup company called Embeddle, no saying where that came from, that also tries to build these very small small models that can fit into small systems, into embedded systems. Unfortunately, they use methods which first need a big model. So we need to do something that can produce these small models from scratch. Maybe a quick last question before we go over to the very last session today. No, but maybe we. Oh, there's one there.
Yeah, sorry, Paul. Thanks for a great presentation. I'm not a data scientist, but I like maths. Yeah, a bit what he was touching about, I thought that like all these neural networks, for them to be accurate and not to overfit, they needed like a big amount of data with many parameters. So I'm just wondering, how does this, what you talked about, look like that works on small training data, and how would like a model like that look like?
Well, okay, so the earlier generation of neural networks, recurrent neural networks, were actually much smaller. And you could easily train those in a university computer, and with a GPU, it became like a matter of an hour. They never achieved the level of comprehensive accuracy that attentional heads. But you can add attention to them. They'll still be more portable if they can be rendered smarter by improving the learning algorithm. Looking at things like backpropagation and gradient descent, and seeing to what extent those can be improved upon from that is looking for a global optimum. Perhaps building inductive biases directly into the system to cut down the search space will allow you to still use a neural network, but reduce the amount of training that it requires to get not one-shot learning, not from a huge pre-trained model, but from scratch. So these are research challenges. I do not have the immediate answer. I leave it to a younger generation to take these on. But I think that they are the challenges of the moment, rather than simply putting together a variance of the current systems that we have now.
All right, thanks a lot. And here is your gift from...
I finally graduated.
The UNICEF School in the Box for you. Thanks again to Shalom.
So we're now going to have a panel discussion. We're going to take some rejig the stage a little bit. So if you want to stand up and stretch your legs for about 2 minutes, you can do so. But please don't leave if you don't have to.
Remember the mingle, maybe the mingle in the food.
And I want to remind you... Hello? Yeah. I want to remind you also that we do have a mingle with some nice drinks and some food. That's going to happen at 5 o'clock in the restaurant outside. So please stay for that and continue the discussions.
streamas ut i etern liksom.
Yeah, and Weitzman.
He calls it the Turing trap.
Right,
I think I
and
need some of this myself.
Stay
started warning
hydrated.
about
Yes,
AI in the 60s.
very important.
About
Yeah,
industrial
he was
usage of
complaining
it.
a long time.
Exactly, and military uses of it. And Minsky was no automation interest whatsoever. It's completely interested.
This focus on automation, of course, is all these companies doing it now.
Exactly.
You can't blame
Of
Turing
course,
for that.
because they're making money.
So I don't know if people want to, hello? So if people want to start taking their seats again, we just got one item left in this room, and that's a small panel discussion. So for that we have Devdutt Dubashi, professor here at Chalmers in AI and data science, Shalom Lappin, who you just heard speak, Hanna Ruschemeier, and Henrik Berglund. So I will simply hand over to you. What's your reflections of the day?
This is turned on? Yes. Well, I thought this was great, and my spontaneous reflection is congratulations for organizing this. I think the fact that it covers legal, technical, and political, economical issues, I think is necessary for this type of phenomenon to be kind of comprehensively understood and addressed. So, I think this type of half day is very productive and very useful. On that note, can I ask a question? So this is perhaps more to you, Hanna. I was thinking both you and I think Daron were talking about some of the lawsuits going on and the fact that this is a fuzzy or hard to nail down legal entity or legal phenomenon. So I was thinking, do you see new kind of legal rights emerging out of this? I mean, it's like many of these things cannot really be covered by copyrights and that type of thing in a very obvious manner. Do you see new property rights emerging out of this whole AI LLM training development?
Yes, thank you. Excellent question. I'm not a specialist in copyright law, but from what I see in the current lawsuits, it's actually not that hard because there are obviously copyright violations via OpenAI and ChatGPT. So I think the harder legal question is how to design the law in the future, and this also applies to the mass privacy violations by scraping the whole internet for training data. So I don't think focusing on individual rights or property rights or even creating new property rights, like the reference to data ownership in the second presentation made me a bit nervous from a legal point of view, because especially in German scholarship we had this huge debate about whether data can be a subject to property. I don't think it's the right way for various reasons. I will talk to you about during the drinks and mingle if you're interested, but this will take up so long. So in short, no, I don't think individual rights are the right tool. I think we need to focus on systemic solutions. We need to think about facilitating public interest, societal rights, maybe collective enforcement mechanisms. We have the collective rights directive in the EU. This is a step in the right direction, but they're still based on individual rights. But the problem is, due to the informal power asymmetry, the enforcement of the individual rights, like I mentioned with the data subjects, the right to erasure, the right to correct, etc., will never be successful against these powerful actors. So I think we need more systemic solutions. Tax legislation would be a systemic solution. The systemic risk and the DSA would be a systemic solution. The obligation to register AI systems in the AI Act would be a systemic solution, for example.
Yeah, so that was a great start. I think one of the things that comes out in the discussion today is that how complex and complicated the problem is, and you need perspectives from many different angles. So Hanna, you talked about from the law perspective, but you said you didn't understand the technology very well, and you're not a technology expert, but you need the technology input into the discussion. And similarly, in the other direction, maybe Shalom is somebody from the insider from the technology, but you don't necessarily know the legal status and so on. But this seems to be a very urgent problem here. I mean, the legal framework is already has been lagging when these technologies are coming up, and now they seem to be stalling even more. You said that it's not very clear cut at the moment, but it's very urgent to do this, right? So, Shalom, do you want to take this up and think about what could technology and science and technology people provide as input to somebody like Hannah and others on the legal side in order to steer it towards a regulatory framework which seems to be very urgently needed right now?
Well, you and I, as I recall, were worried about this problem when we wrote our article in The Guardian, is what a reasonable regulatory agency or regime would look like. And I believe you directed me to an article by a legal scholar in America who is in the process of devising anti-monopoly legislation for the Biden administration. And I gather, like all good proposals, it wasn't implemented. But I think what motivated it, and this is what impressed me, because I read what you suggested, was a point that Hannah seems to be making, which is that the issue wasn't so much individual rights as social benefit and avoiding harm to the idea that, which is not entirely new. I mean, in the progressive age, in the 20s, a lot of anti-monopoly and antitrust legislation was motivated less by concern for individual rights and more by creating the kind of economy and society that was perceived to be fair. And it seems to me that notion of social benefit as itself a legitimate consideration in framing legislation is crucial, because the damage that's being done might not violate the rights of individual users in a way that we can prosecute under a current legal system, but it's certainly doing vast amounts of damage on a social level and on a political level. So if these are not permitted to be, because of the atomization of the social vision of recent influential political ideologies, then it's necessary to change those ideologies.
Can I add something?
Absolutely.
There's a parallelism to climate change and environmental law that is quite obvious when you're familiar with the topic, because there we have the same problems of how to design a law and legal instruments which are not based on the European dogmatics of fundamental rights are deeply rooted in the protection of the individual. And this is a good thing, for the record. I don't want to change that. But this is the reason why we are struggling in designing law in a different way, and also when it comes to fighting climate change or protect the environment via environmental law, etc. We are struggling in establishing effective enforcement mechanisms, and it's similar with the oversight of AI and digital legislation when it comes to create something to protect societal interest and the public good and sustainability, for example. I mean, sustainability from the understanding of the UN sustainability goals is not only in protecting the environment, but to protect future generation, to establish some kind of fairness, social justice, etc. So AI is challenging all of this.
The thing that struck me in your talk was that you had this picture which showed that governments are supposed to act for the good of its citizens, but what you also showed was that they were actually in the formulation of the EU AI Act, they have been actually acting more in the interests of corporations, two German and French corporations that you mentioned, and maybe the big international giants. So it seems to be maybe there is a big political angle to this as well. So maybe should we open it up to questions from the audience?
Absolutely, I think so.
1, 2, 1, 2. Okay, great. So, full disclosure. So I'm a professor here at Chalmers. So I'm working with technology. So what can I do to help?
Who wants to take the crack at that?
Well, we had a discussion earlier today, and it seems that we were converging very much on. So it seems to be the kind of work you're doing is helping. Keep doing what you're doing.
But the thing is that so the engineering excuse is like, I only build systems, I don't use them, right? So the question is our biggest impact as engineers is actually to interact with the policy and decision makers in order to make them understand technology. Is that our role? I think so, but is it the only role that we can take?
You can provide critical education to your students. I mean, there should be a course of...
I'm teaching a compulsory course in philosophy of science and philosophy of technology to all the PhD students here. So one of the things, and that another part of that course is an ethics course. So one of the things that we communicate very clearly is that, as opposed to perhaps natural science, which is just descriptive of how nature works, technology is very much a human endeavor. You know, it's our purposes, our goals that shape technology. And to not cop out from one's responsibility as an engineer or technologist just because science might be neutral, and to clarify that this comes with certain ethical consequences and responsibilities.
I can say that I contributed also by doing a first edition of a course called AI Risks, which had this as a central component of the course.
Yeah, we're doing our part.
Some of the students in the course are sitting there. I don't know what they thought about it, but maybe we can do better versions of the course. We can maybe combine it with it.
I'm not persuaded that there is this radical disjunction between engineering and science. I think in order to get good engineering, you need good science.
Sure.
And one of the reasons that we're not getting the kind of engineering we want is that the science has not been allowed to develop the way it should. So one of the things that we can do in the universities is insist that the funding agencies not necessarily fund the most fashionable research that has corporate approval, but that it be willing to experiment with foundational work that is of scientific value, but not any obvious commercial value. There's far too much emphasis on monetizing and patenting work. I remember at IBM, our great concern was to make sure that what we did wasn't patentable. Otherwise, the lawyers would delay the publications of our conference papers for 2 years. There's nothing wrong with patents and engineering and making money. I'm not against any of that. But I think that when the really good foundational science starts to dry up, then the questions about what's the alternative to large language models become very pressing. And the fact that that in the area of machine learning, that a lot of the very interesting and original ideas that were around of a theoretical and a mathematical sort that could have possibly provided interesting alternatives started to dry up with the emergence of large language models and their corporate success. So therefore, it seems to me we have an obligation to say, this is all fine, but here are the problems. The engineering is not working out that well. We need better science to support better engineering.
I agree, and take interdisciplinary work seriously. Do not just bring the ethicist or the lawyer in to write half of the page of the funding application for the ethical and legal assessment, but talk with them from the beginning. I mean, you have valuable insights for us as well.
Hear me? Yeah? Oh, hello. Thank you very much for the talk. I was wondering, I guess it's a question to you, Hannah. Do you think we can reflect on what we need to know about AI and AI governance from regulating emerging technologies before? So for example, nanotechnology, because it was enabling and emerging, and we were very worried about it at the time. What lessons do you think are applicable in this case? And what do you think was contextual to that completely other domain? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. That's a very good question. I mean, we are at this stage discussing an AI Act which regulatory scheme is closely connected to product safety law. This is deeply connected with the regulation of other emerging technologies. And the underlying legal assumption of every regulation is the balancing of risks and benefits. So we always have to go back to the principle of proportionality from risk prevention law. So, I mean, I'm a public lawyer. Everything goes back to the Constitution, right? So, of course, the widening of interest and the principle of proportionality is the same. But I think AI operates in a totally different environment and after different logics than nanotechnology, which can be a very isolated technology for certain use cases and not spreading scalable in our everyday lives where there's just no excuse. So I think what worked well on nanotechnology regulation was that we had the time, the capacities to develop certain very specific safety standards and regulation, while now AI and also the regulatory process is from a completely different stage. And I think we have to acknowledge that also when you engage with everyday life of people, it's always different. So I think we can learn something from that in the case that it goes back to the same fundamental assumptions of balancing interests. But on the other hand, I think, yeah, AI is a whole different story.
I'm a very interested but fairly new amateur on this area, and I think this forum is very important. I'm kind of curious if the images we saw before, when it comes to the balance between the industrial initiatives and where the money is, and contra the academic world, I kind of want to ask how we make the politicians and the decision makers more skillful and knowledgeable concerning the balance between how, in fact, the AI area can benefit the human beings more than only automation of different applications. So I'm kind of curious what kind of forums or contacts, for example, in Sweden do we have, or maybe in the States or otherwhere, to really make them more skillful and understand. Going back to the presentation that Daron had and the graphics he showed us, where the different academic area and the industry and so on. So I'm kind of curious, what kind of firms or contacts do we have to make the politician decision makers more skillful? Thank you.
Maybe Moa can answer that question. There's something that you received a question about the Swedish parliament.
Yes, as a matter of fact, so occasionally the Riksdag send out requests to universities about experts, and I did actually mention your name as well. So who knows? It might be that the Swedish Riksdag will call us one day and ask us to come and answer some question, in which case we will, of course. So that's one way. Maybe you want to add something?
Well, I think it's a bit... I know two engineers. I've been in contact with two engineers who are in the Riksdag. I think they are the two ones, right? And I think this is perhaps a bit of a problem that in this day and age that we don't really see technological and scientific knowledge as part of just civic education, and that so many people who are in positions of legislative and political power don't necessarily know very much about technology and technological systems and socio-technical systems and how they intermix with one another. So, this is a huge question, of course, but I think if we go back in time, we saw many more amateur scientists with political power, and I think we these days have very little of people with technical knowledge in these positions. Not sure exactly what to do about it, but it would be nice to have more technically educated policymakers.
So we're running out of time, right? Maybe the last few questions.
Thank you for the talk. So my question is a bit for Hannah. As a background, I'm a PhD student in computer science, so not very much knowledgeable about law, but I think one of the biggest sort of points people point out when talking about tech companies and balancing is the data ownership. And then you mentioned that that's not a good way for law. So kind of puzzled by that. And it's also because I would argue that like collective bargaining is, as a citizen's right, has been encouraged by a lot of the companies that actually are using the data ownership laws as sort of part of their benefits as well. So in that context, the companies that are already interested in encouraging on citizens' rights, and then why do we not strike back, as it were, to say, you know, we take ownership of collective bargaining and data?
Okay, thank you. Data ownership and the possibility for collective bargaining are two separate things from my perspective. But on data ownership, coming from fundamental rights dogmatics, we understand property is the right to exclusively use something and to exclude everyone else from the use. This is not transferable to data, and this is not something you want for data. This is the short answer. I can give you the long answer later.
Which is why new kinds of rights might be, a way forward.
Maybe.
Yeah.
There is maybe a good point to stop. And I want to remind you that there's wine and nibbles in the restaurant.
Nibbles.
Yes. So there you can get a long answer from Hannah and continue the discussion with each other and with us. So I would like to thank you very much for attending this seminar today, and let's continue out in the restaurant. Thank you.